When a waitress refused to serve an elderly veteran, she had no idea who he really was. His weathered hands told a story she couldn't read. The dog tags hidden beneath his faded shirt, they changed everything. Moments later, the entire restaurant fell silent as military officers entered. What happened next stunned everyone. Nobody saw it coming. The morning sun barely broke through the heavy clouds as Harold Jenkins shuffled into the Sunrise Diner. His faded Vietnam veteran cap sat proudly on his silver hair, though his worn khaki jacket and simple plaid shirt had seen better days. At 78, his back remained straight despite the years, a habit formed during his time in the Marines. The small brass pin on his cap, marking him as part of the 3rd Battalion, gleamed dully in the fluorescent lighting of the diner's entrance. Harold paused at the door to let an elderly woman exit before him. "Thank you, young man," she said with a warm smile, not noticing how his weathered hands gently guided the door for her. Such courtesy was second nature to Harold, a relic from a time when people looked out for one another. The breakfast rush had ended an hour ago, leaving the diner half empty. The smell of coffee and bacon still hung in the air as Harold made his way to the hostess stand. His movements were deliberate but not slow, the careful precision of a man who had once navigated through jungle terrain where one misstep meant death. "Table for one, please," Harold said quietly to the young hostess who was scrolling through her phone, her artificially long nails clicking against the screen. She looked up with undisguised disinterest, eyes flickering over his weathered face and worn clothes. Her gaze lingered momentarily on the small American flag pin affixed to his jacket lapel, then dismissed it. "We're pretty busy right now," she said, though half the table sat empty. "Maybe try the coffee shop down the street. They do senior discounts." Harold glanced around the quiet diner, but nodded politely. His pale blue eyes, still sharp despite the wrinkles that framed them, took in the many vacant tables. He'd faced far worse than a rude hostess in his lifetime. "I understand. Would it be possible to just sit at the counter then? I don't take up much space." With a dramatic sigh that suggested she was doing him an enormous favor, she grabbed a laminated menu. "Fine. Counter only." She walked away quickly, leaving Harold to follow at his measured pace, the slight limp in his right leg barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, a souvenir from a firefight outside Key Sand that had earned him his first Purple Heart. As he settled onto a stool, carefully hanging his worn jacket on the hook underneath the counter, Harold noticed a young waitress whispering to the hostess, both glancing his way with undisguised disdain. The waitress rolled her eyes and made a drinking motion with her hand. Harold pretended not to notice. He'd faced worse in Danang. An older couple seated nearby watched the interaction with growing discomfort. The man, silver-haired and dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, frowned as he observed the way the staff treated Harold. Harold waited patiently, his calloused hands resting on the countertop. The fingers of his left hand occasionally tapped a rhythm only he remembered, a habit formed during long nights on watch. His dog tags remained hidden beneath his faded plaid shirt, just as the scars on his body remained hidden from view. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Servers bustled past him without acknowledgement. One even reached across him to grab ketchup bottles without a word. Harold remained stoic, his face a mask of patience that had been perfected in POW camps where showing emotion was a luxury no one could afford. "What can I get you?" The waitress finally approached, her voice flat and unwelcoming. Her name tag read Kimberly Manager, though she couldn't have been older than 25. "Good morning," Harold smiled warmly, genuine despite her coldness. "Just coffee and your breakfast special, please. And thank you for your service," he added gently, noticing the small American flag pin on her apron. "What?" Kimberly's brow furrowed, her irritation poorly concealed. "Your pin," Harold pointed to the small American flag. "I always thank anyone who supports our country." Kimberly rolled her eyes. "Whatever. We need this counter space for paying customers who actually order real food. Coffee's $5, by the way." Harold's calloused hands slowly reached for his worn wallet. The leather was cracked with age, held together with duct tape along one edge. "I am ordering food, miss." "Look." She leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not enough that others couldn't hear. "We get your type in here all the time. Order the cheapest thing, nurse it for hours, leave no tip. I've got bills to pay." The older couple at a nearby table exchanged glances. The woman half rose as if to intervene, but her husband gently touched her arm, his eyes never leaving Harold. "I understand," Harold said quietly, slowly standing. His eyes remained downcast as he carefully pushed the stool back into place. "Thank you anyway." Finally, Kimberly muttered, loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Maybe try the shelter downtown. They serve free breakfast." Harold's face flushed with embarrassment, the red creeping up his neck in stark contrast to his silver hair. But his expression remained dignified. He'd survived things that would have broken someone like her. This was merely a moment of discomfort, not a firefight with lives hanging in the balance. As Harold turned to leave, his movement caused his shirt to pull slightly open at the collar. His military dog tags clinked softly against his chest. His hands, steady even in humiliation, carefully straightened his veteran's cap. "Sir," a small voice called. A young boy, no more than 8, had slipped away from his mother and now stood beside Harold. "Is that a real soldier hat?" Harold knelt slowly, his joints protesting, until he was eye level with the child. "Yes, it is, young man. My grandpa was a soldier too. Mom says he's a hero." "Then your grandpa and I have something in common." Harold smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes. The boy's mother approached, looking embarrassed. "Tommy, don't bother the gentleman." She gave Harold an apologetic smile. "No bother at all, ma'am," Harold said, rising slowly to his feet. "You have a fine young man there." As Harold finally turned to leave, he held the door for a group entering the restaurant. "Good morning." He nodded to each person, his voice warm despite the treatment he'd just received. The last person through the door was a tall man in a business suit who gave Harold a curious look. "Heading out already? The breakfast here is worth the wait." "Not today," Harold replied quietly. "But thank you." As the door closed behind him, Harold stood for a moment on the sidewalk. The clouds had darkened further, promising rain. Just like that day outside Saigon when they'd evacuated the orphanage under fire. Some memories never faded, while common courtesy seemed to be disappearing with each passing year. What happened next would change everyone in that diner forever. Mark Davidson, the gray-haired man seated with his wife at the table nearest the counter, couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed. As the owner of several local businesses, including a car dealership down the street, he recognized disrespect when he saw it. But this was something altogether different. This was shameful. "Excuse me, dear," he whispered to his wife Patricia, slipping his phone from his pocket. His fingers moved quickly over the screen, sending a text message as his eyes tracked Harold's slow progress toward the door. "What are you doing?" Patricia asked, her voice tight with indignation over what they'd just witnessed. "Making a call that's long overdue," Mark replied, his jaw set in determination. He had recognized something in the old veteran's bearing, a quiet dignity that reminded him of his father, who'd served in Korea. Some things a man didn't forget, and the way a real soldier carried himself was one of them. Through the large front windows, they watched as Harold paused by the entrance outside, taking a moment to compose himself. He removed his cap briefly, running a hand through his silver hair before replacing it with military precision. Even in this small gesture, his training showed. Inside, conversations had resumed, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort. Several patrons cast disapproving glances toward Kimberly, who seemed oblivious to the tension her actions had created. "Did you see how she treated that poor man?" a woman whispered to her companion at a nearby booth. "Disgraceful," her friend replied. "My son's in the army. I'd hate to think someone would treat him that way when he's older." Harold stood quietly under the awning, gazing up at the darkening sky. His eyes, sharp despite his age, scanned the street with the awareness of someone who had once needed to notice everything to stay alive. Across the road, a young mother struggled with a stroller and shopping bags as she tried to navigate around a puddle. Without hesitation, Harold crossed over to help her. "Allow me, ma'am," he said gently, taking the heaviest bags while steadying the stroller with his other hand. "Thank you so much," the woman smiled gratefully. Not many people would bother these days. Just doing what anyone should, Harold replied with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The encounter with the waitress had affected him more than he cared to admit, even to himself. Inside the diner, Mark's phone vibrated. He read the message, a small smile forming at the corners of his mouth. "It won't be long now," he murmured to Patricia, who squeezed his hand in response. "What did you do?" she asked. "I made a call to an old friend, Robert Stevens. We served together on the City Veterans Affairs Committee. And Robert happens to be a colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve. He's making some calls." Meanwhile, Harold had taken a seat on a bench across the street, adjusting his position to ease the ache in his right leg, the one that still held fragments of shrapnel from that terrible day in '68. The first drops of rain began to fall, speckling the sidewalk around him. He made no move to seek shelter, having endured far worse than a little rain in his lifetime. In the diner, Kimberly was laughing with the hostess. "Did you see his face? Like I was supposed to be impressed by some old cap and tags. Probably bought them at an army surplus store." The hostess giggled nervously, but her eyes darted around to see if anyone had overheard. "Maybe we should have just served him coffee." "Please," Kimberly scoffed. "Those tables are for real customers, not charity cases." What they didn't notice was that Frank Miller, the diner's owner, had emerged from his office in the back. He stood silently, taking in the scene, his face darkening as he listened to Kimberly's words. Harold wasn't angry as he sat in the light rain, just disappointed. Not for himself, but for what it represented. Back in his day, people looked out for each other, respected sacrifice. In the steaming jungles of Vietnam, a man's background hadn't mattered, only his character. They'd fought for each other, bled for each other. Some never made a home. His mind drifted back to the rice paddies, to friends who never came home, to the day his commander had placed the Bronze Star in his trembling hands. For actions above and beyond. The medal now sat in a drawer at home. Harold never spoke of such things. The true heroes, he believed, were the ones who never made it back. The old soldier's weathered hands traced the outline of something in his pocket, a faded photograph he always carried. For young Marines, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing despite the mud and danger that surrounded them. Only Harold had returned home. Across town, a black SUV pulled away from the local military liaison office. Inside, a phone call was being made. "Sir, we've confirmed it's him. Harold Jenkins, 3rd Battalion, Special Operations. The file's classified, but..." The voice paused. "Yes, sir. I understand the significance. We're on our way now." The voice belonged to Major Sarah Mitchell, who had spent the last 15 minutes reading a heavily redacted file that had required 3 separate security clearances to access. What little remained visible had left her speechless. "Driver, make it quick," she ordered, straightening her uniform. "And call ahead to General Phillips. Tell him we've confirmed identity and location." Back in the diner, Frank Miller approached Kimberly at the counter. "What happened with that older gentleman who was just here?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Kimberly shrugged. "Just some old guy trying to take up counter space. Don't worry, I handled it." "Handled it how exactly?" Frank pressed, his expression growing stormy. Before she could answer, Mark Davidson stood up from his table and approached them. "Your waitress refused service to a Vietnam veteran," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Treated him like garbage." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the diner. Frank's face paled. His own father had served in Vietnam. "Kimberly, is this true?" he demanded. "He was just some old homeless guy in a fake military cap," she protested, but her confidence was wavering. "He was wearing dog tags," Patricia Davidson added, joining her husband. "And he conducted himself with more dignity than I've seen in a long time." Outside, the rain fell harder now as 3 black government vehicles with official military plates pulled up outside the Sunrise Diner. Harold, still seated on the bench across the street, watched with mild curiosity as car doors opened in perfect synchronization. Little did Kimberly know, her ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but. The rain fell harder now as 3 black government vehicles pulled up outside the Sunrise Diner. Harold, still seated on the bench across the street, watched with mild curiosity as car doors opened in perfect synchronization. His trained, I noticed the military precision in the movements of the men and women who emerged, the kind of discipline that becomes second nature after years of service. Inside the diner, the bell above the door chimed as it swung open. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The sudden silence was broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the windows and the soft squeak of polished shoes on the linoleum floor. 6 uniformed officers entered, led by a distinguished man with silver hair and the unmistakable bearing of high command. The stars on his shoulders gleamed under the diner's lights. A major general, flanked by an honor guard of officers representing every branch of the military. Behind him stood a woman in a crisp Marine dress uniform, her chest adorned with ribbons and medals indicating service in Iraq and Afghanistan. Water droplets clung to their caps and shoulders, but none made any move to remove their headgear or wipe away the moisture. Their focus was singular and intense. "I'm looking for the manager," the general announced, his voice carrying throughout the now silent restaurant. It wasn't particularly loud, but it carried the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Frank stepped forward nervously, straightening his tie. "I'm Frank Miller, the owner. How can I help you, sir?" The general's eyes swept over him dismissively. "I understand one of your staff refused service to a veteran this morning. Elderly gentleman, Vietnam vet." Kimberly stood frozen beside the counter, her face draining of color. The hostess had mysteriously disappeared into the kitchen. That's correct, sir," Frank stammered, shooting a dark look at Kimberly. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." Mark Davidson stood up from his table. "I saw the whole thing, General. This young lady," he pointed directly at Kimberly, "treated him shamefully, told him to go to a shelter." The general's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. He turned his attention to Kimberly. "You're the one who refused him service?" Kimberly stepped forward, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. That's me, sir. But he looked. I didn't know he was." "That man," the general cut her off, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "is Sergeant Major Harold Jenkins." The female Marine officer beside him stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio. Sergeant Major Jenkins served 3 tours in Vietnam with Marine Special Operations. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor for rescuing 17 men under heavy fire after their position was overrun. She paused, looking directly at Kimberly. He later received the Purple Heart twice and was personally commended by President Nixon for actions that saved American lives. She turned a page in the portfolio. Much of his service record remains classified to this day, but I can tell you that operations he participated in were instrumental to saving hundreds of American lives. The Marine's voice carried both respect and tightly controlled anger. Sergeant Major Jenkins continued serving his country in various capacities until 1990. A collective gasp went through the diner. An elderly woman at a nearby table pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Mark stood up from his table. "I saw the whole thing, General. This young lady and her hostess treated him shamefully, refused him service, mocked him, told him to go to a homeless shelter." The diner had gone completely still. Even the cooks had emerged from the kitchen, standing in shocked silence by the service window. The hostess peeked out from behind them, her face a mask of shame. "Where is Sergeant Major Jenkins now?" the general asked, his voice deceptively calm. Mark pointed across the street, where Harold sat alone in the rain, seemingly oblivious to the water soaking through his thin jacket. Without another word, the general turned and walked out, his officers following in perfect formation. Every person in the diner rushed to the windows, pressing against the glass to watch what happened next. The general stopped directly in front of Harold and raised his right hand in a solemn salute. The other officers formed a perfect semicircle behind him, each rendering their own salute in perfect unison. Harold, who had been lost in memories of another rainy day half a world away, looked up in surprise. For a moment, confusion crossed his weathered features. Then, recognition dawned in his eyes. Slowly, with dignity that belied his years, Harold Jenkins stood. His old body straightened to its full height, shoulders squaring as decades seemed to fall away from him. He returned the salute with perfect military precision, his weathered hand steady at his brow. Inside the diner, not a single eye remained dry as the general stepped forward and embraced the elderly veteran. Words were exchanged that no one could hear, but Harold's nod was visible to all. The general then removed his own jacket and placed it around Harold's shoulders despite the old soldier's protests. When they turned toward the restaurant, every person inside could see the quiet dignity in Harold's face. There was no triumph there, no vindication. Only the same quiet strength that had carried him through jungle firefights and years of silent service to a country that too often forgot its heroes. The bell chimed again as the door opened, admitting Harold and his military escort. The general's hand remained firmly on Harold's shoulder as they entered, a gesture of both respect and subtle support for legs that had carried too many burdens for too many years. This establishment, the general announced, his voice ringing with authority, will be serving Sergeant Major Jenkins today. It wasn't a request, and I believe the manager has something she would like to say. Every eye in the place turned to Kimberly, whose face had gone from pale to ashen as the truth of what she had done sank in. Tears welled in her eyes as she confronted the enormity of her mistake. I believe an apology is in order, the general prompted when Kimberly remained frozen in place. Frank stepped forward, his face a mask of professional concern overlaying genuine distress. Sergeant Major Jenkins, on behalf of the Sunrise Diner, I offer my most sincere apologies for the treatment you received today. It is completely unacceptable and does not reflect our values or how we wish to treat any customer, let alone a decorated veteran who has sacrificed so much for our country. Harold nodded graciously, but the general's expression remained stern. I believe a young lady who refused service has something personal to add. The Marine major who had read Harold's service record stepped closer to Kimberly. That would be you, miss, she said quietly. Kimberly's hands trembled visibly as she took a small step forward. The diner was so quiet you could hear the rain pattering against the windows, the soft whir of the ceiling fans, the nervous swallow as she struggled to find words. The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Harold's eyes, kind despite everything, met hers without judgment. It only made her shame more acute. What happened in the next few minutes would change the Sunrise Diner forever. Kimberly's hands trembled as she stepped forward. Tears streamed down her face as she faced Harold, the enormity of her actions weighing on her like a physical burden. "I'm so deeply sorry, sir," she said, her voice breaking. "There is no excuse for how I treated you. I was cruel and disrespectful, and I judged you without knowing anything about you." She paused, struggling to maintain her composure. "My grandfather served in Desert Storm. He would be ashamed of me today." Harold, ever gracious, simply nodded. "We all have bad days, young lady." His voice carried no condemnation, only understanding that made her feel even smaller. "No, sir," Kimberly insisted, finding her courage. "This wasn't just a bad day. This was wrong, and I need to own that. I hope someday I can make it right." The general's stern expression softened slightly. Acknowledgement is the first step toward change. The diner's owner, Frank Miller, pushed through the crowd that had gathered. His face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and determination. "Sergeant Major Jenkins, please allow me to offer you the finest meal in our establishment on the house, today and whenever you wish to return." But the general raised his hand. "Actually, we have something else in mind." He turned to Harold. "Sergeant Major, with your permission, we'd like to make this an opportunity for education rather than simply punishment." Harold's eyes twinkled for the first time that day. "I've always believed in teaching rather than scolding, sir." The general nodded, then addressed the entire restaurant. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're witnessing something important today. It's easy to forget that the elderly man or woman you pass on the street may have once stood on the front lines defending your freedom. It's easy to judge by appearances." His eyes lingered briefly on Kimberly before continuing. "Sergeant Major Jenkins here is just one of many veterans who walk among us without fanfare or recognition. They don't ask for special treatment. but they've earned our respect. By evening, local news vans had gathered outside the Sunrise Diner. Reporters interviewed Harold, who spoke not of the disrespect he'd faced, but of the importance of honoring all veterans. "It's not about me," he told a young reporter with a camera. "It's about remembering what service means." The story of Harold Jenkins and how a community rallied around him spread like wildfire across social media and national news. By the following morning, the diner's phone rang constantly with calls from veterans sharing similar experiences and from citizens wanting to help make amends. Within a week, Frank had installed a permanent veterans table in the most prominent spot in the diner, reserved for any service member, past or present. Above it hung a framed photo of Harold in his dress uniform from 1968, along with a display case containing military memorabilia donated by local veterans, medals, patches, and photographs that told the story of service and sacrifice across generations. Kimberly, transformed by the experience, personally oversaw a new diner policy. All veterans ate at half price. The receipt for the discount read simply, "Thank you for your service. We remember." She spent her free time volunteering at the local VA hospital, often accompanied by the hostess who had initially turned Harold away. Together, they listened to stories from men and women whose service spanned from World War II to Afghanistan. "I never realized," Kimberly confided to Harold one morning as she served him his usual breakfast. "These stories, they should be taught in schools." "Perhaps that's your calling," Harold suggested gently, "to help others see what you now see." Harold himself remained unchanged by his newfound celebrity. He still held doors open for strangers and always said please and thank you. His clothes remained simple, though friends had insisted on buying him a new jacket for winter. His apartment stayed the same modest one-bedroom he'd lived in for 20 years, despite offers of assistance from veterans organizations. Every Tuesday, he came to the diner for breakfast, always leaving generous tips from his modest pension. He'd politely decline Frank's offer of free meals, insisting on paying his share. "The discount is more than generous," he'd said firmly. But something else had changed. Now, when Harold entered, conversations paused, not in discomfort, but in respect. Children were quietly instructed by parents about why they should stand when Mr. Jenkins arrived.